we talked about this before. Okay. A definition, like you put it in a class, and then you say how it's different from the other things that are in that class, right? So you take what it is, and then what its specific difference is. So genus and species. And so usually, if you can't define something that way, then you can't define it. Okay. So the problem of evil. All right. This kind of will piggyback a lot on what we talked about last week. Let's just talk about that general approach to it first. Yes.
Who is this person on the ground in the picture?
I still don't know who that is. So somebody needs to do the research on this, because I'm not going to do it.
Did you assume it was Aristotle?
No, I assumed one of the guys beside him was Aristotle. What do you think, Connie?
Isn't that, what's his name? The same who was described.
See, I don't know, because he doesn't have the halo around him, right?
Is it considered a necessary use of the internet?
Sure. If you want to research who that guy is, I think it's Averroes, which was a Muslim philosopher that lived around the time of Aquinas. But I don't know.
Do you have a source for this picture?
Google.
So why is the quality so bad of this picture?
Well, it's because I picked it at some point and didn't change it, because once you made fun of my slides, I didn't change it at all.
True.
This is the same one that when you made fun of my slides, I had I at least would change the cover photo each time. But that day you made fun of my slides when I made fun of your blankie.
I thought you said you were going to change the slides.
Yeah, but then I was like, no way. Casey's not going to make me change the slides.
I'm sure that was very intentional.
Yeah, I put my foot down, yeah.
Now we're going to be wondering who that is forever.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's like...
artwork that has certain random guidelines.
Maybe it's all of us. Okay, we'll make it like more profound.
Oh no, that guy's
learning. No, he has a hat on. Who could tell? He has a beard though. All right. So the problem of evil, and we don't know who the guy is. So the best way to approach it, I think, is we have to first sort of make a few distinctions. Because when you talk about evil, right, you talk about the intellectual problem, which it becomes like a matter of logic or evidence, depending on how we approach it. But then there's also the emotional problem, right? Like the actual person that's, for lack of a better word, person who's suffering, right? So, like all of our answers ultimately have to sort of, in some way, connect back to God's answer to the question of the problem of evil, right? What is God's answer? It's Christ on the cross, right? So we can come up with all these answers, right? And think about it, like in a lot of ways, like all of the sort of modern philosophies and not so modern all center around the question of suffering and evil, right? Like what's the number one, which we'll talk about, what's the number one argument against the existence of God?
God was all good and all powerful.
Yeah, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, right? So that's the atheist argument. Centers around the problem of evil. Keegan.
I don't know how much you're intending to go into this quote, but is that exclusive to those who love him?
Yes. Now, whether that is at the time that it happens, like that's a totally different thing, right? So,
my question is, if we say God loves all things, then He doesn't just love those who love Him.
Yeah. So this is actually what we're going to talk about at the end, because we tested the waters last week about God's love, and we're gonna finish it this week. Yes, Conor.
So couldn't you say that argument is, like the problem of evil is a specific argument against the Christian God, but someone like a deist wouldn't necessarily have a problem with the fact they're suffering because they just said, well, God showed up, He made it, and then He backed away.
Yeah, but that ultimately though that's an explanation, right? Like he's not here now. Like so it's ultimately like Buddhism. What like Buddha goes out and he sees the suffering. So what does that becomes his problem to solve, right? And he's like, oh, well, the reason why anybody suffers is because they desire stuff, and well, let's just cut off desire, and then we won't have any suffering, right? And then it goes so far as like evil's an illusion. But there's also things like we'll talk about like liberation theology. You guys know what liberation theology is? Yeah. It's essentially like Catholicism with Marxism mixed in, which we'll talk about at the end because they are sort of argue that God's not all powerful. Yes.
I was just going to say, like, particularly the formation which you often hear of the whole all good and all powerful would be an argument against the Christian God, because the claim about the Christian God is that He's all good and all powerful.
Yeah. All right. So, but ultimately, right, we always have to keep in mind God's answer. All right, and to still understand that the way that God that's evil and suffering, especially for the suffering person, is not like a puzzle that we can kind of just unpack and figure it all out, right? Like a lot of it is just pick up your cross and follow me. All right. So obviously, and we'll talk about this towards the end about how we deal with people that are suffering. What we talk about today, like the intellectual problem, like this is for us to keep it straight, right? But when you meet a suffering person, you don't go, well, evil's really not a thing. Doesn't have any like. This wouldn't be the approach, right? The approach would be to bring them to Christ and to model Christ to them, all right? And so understanding how God uses suffering and ultimately why He creates a world with suffering, that's in the plans of Providence, right? Like if you could somehow get His blueprints, then maybe you would understand. So we always have to sort of, it's always going to get to the point where we just, and we'll probably do it several times today, where we just go, I don't know. And we can give good reasons, but ultimately we can say, I don't know. And we have to go point back to the cross. Okay? All right, so let's go to to evil as an intellectual problem. All right, so Epicurus was probably the first one to sort of articulate the issue with omnipotence, omnibenevolence, and God's existence. So they have to be pitted together. If there's evil in the world, and God is all powerful and all good, so it's even sort of pre-Christian, right? This Epicurus was a 3rd century BC Greek philosopher, and David Hume, who was an 18th century Scottish philosopher, who was probably best known for being sort of the modern form of skepticism, also came up with this argument in his book, The Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. So we'll just use that, again, to avoid we don't want to set up a straw man, but we'll use that as our sort of guide to get us moving. Okay, so here's what he said. Epicurus' old questions are yet unanswered. Notice he says they're not answered yet. Okay, so is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then He's impotent. Is He able but not willing? Then He's malevolent. Is He both able and willing? Whence then is evil? So we're going to start with his last question first. What is evil? Okay. So if we sort of, by the way, so when St. Thomas in the Summa, when he looks at the existence of God, he only has 2 objections to it, right? And normally, if you read the Summa, there's at least 3 or 4 or 5 objections that he sort of goes at. But for the existence of God, he only has 2, okay? And the first one is that God is superfluous, that we can explain everything without Him. And then he goes through it template. The second one is the problem of evil, okay? And so, as usual, when with St. Thomas, he actually makes the arguments better than the people make them themselves. So we're going to kind of look at the way he formulates the argument, and then we'll use that as our sort of takeoff point. Okay. All right. So he says, if one of 2 contraries is infinite, then the other is completely destroyed. The term God means infinite goodness. If God exists, then evil would not exist. But there is evil in the world, therefore God does not exist. Okay. So that's the argument. All right. Now, just looking at it, like formulated like that, because it's not as, it's the same argument, but he tries to make it into a syllogism. Does anyone just logically see a problem with that?
I don't think the first one is accurate by itself.
Okay, so 2 things that are opposite to each other, that are contrary. So, in other words, completely opposite. If they're both infinite, then the other is completely destroyed. You say that's not valid, or that's not true.
Correct. The obvious example is the God and the devil are completely contrary.
Is the devil?
But they're not both infinite, though.
They don't have to both be infinite. It's one of 2 contraries.
Okay, you're right. Yes.
But you're also arguing from
Christian perspective.
Yeah, which actually this is saying.
Go ahead, Keegan.
Is the problem that God and evil or the devil or whatever not necessarily contrary?
Well, I don't know. Is that?
Well, could God create something that was contrary to himself? Like, that seems...
Go ahead, finish the seams, because, so it is impossible that
Well,
God...
I think this is assuming that because there is an infinite being, that it just blots out all possibility of anything else existing ever. That's kind of the assumption.
Is that not a valid
In a way.
assumption? Because something's infinite, it would be all-encompassing.
But if it's
I
infinitely
want us to
powerful,
sort of just unpack this, right?
so if it's infinitely powerful, it can allow something to exist which is contrary to it.
How so? Can you give me an example? So God. Let's say God is all powerful. Can God make a triangle that has 4 sides?
No.
Okay. So omnipotence isn't. Does that mean he's not omnipotent, or does that mean that he can't create nonsense? Or does it mean, the reason why he's using being, right? Does it mean that a God who, something that is infinite being cannot create non-being? Because create non-being is nonsense. Right? To create is to give being. Can you give being such that there's non-being? Yes, Con.
Evil doesn't actually exist.
Okay. So I'm going to let you hold on to that. In a qualified way, we'll say that, but we're going to really qualify it, right? Keegan.
This isn't necessarily answering your question, but would non-being essentially be something contrary to God? Like,
Well, non-being is nothing contrary to something.
yeah, but like if we say like God is existence itself, then like, because like in this like syllogism or whatever, non-being would not be able to exist. It's like it's silly to say, but like if that's what we're saying is contrary to God, then this is logical instead of evil being contrary to God. But I don't.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Connor's on the right track.
Yeah, I mean...
Number 4 is the problem, because the argument is that evil exists.
Okay.
But evil
But you
is an
have to
absence
say
of the
nothing
good,
for,
so it's really nothing.
I can. There is one that does not. There's one that does not follow, but you guys have not hit it yet.
I mean, if God exists, then evil would not exist.
There, 3. Right.
But my
Does that follow? Does just the fact that God exists, does it follow that evil would not exist?
It follows from 1 and 2 if you assume 1 and 2 are correct, but because we're pulling apart 1 and 2, then no.
Where the term evil is not well defined.
Say that again.
The term evil is not well defined.
Yes. So we have to first define the term evil, right? Define your terms. You guys got that's far down and nobody defined the term. 3 is the problem.
I'm kind of confused though, because like you guys, I feel like you jumped really far past like what 1 is saying, because like 1 doesn't just apply to God; it's applying to many things, right? Like so, like because like,
Well, everything we would term God's attributes, right?
But isn't this just saying if 1 and 2 contraries is infinite and the other is completely infinite? So it's making a connection from base things. So I feel like if we understood that like if heat was infinite, then cold would not exist, or like if light was infinite, darkness would not exist. And then we're taking that and applying it to goodness. And so like we take something that like we feel like would be right, like if rocks were infinite, then there would be no air. And applying it to something like God and goodness, which I don't know if that connects as well, because to start talking about like God directly from that, like I wasn't even convinced of that to begin with.
Yeah. So the issue is every one of your contraries, right, is a created thing.
Okay.
So you can only say it's true analogously.
So it's not purely.
So
It's not fully
light
contrary.
is not light can't be an infinite. Light is a material thing, cannot be infinite. Right?
Okay.
And so analogously, like you could use light and goodness, but
In that situation, though, then the only case that applies is God, because God is something that's infinite, and therefore, like, you either declare from the Christian perspective, like, yes, God is infinite, and therefore, like, he proves that's not true, or you claim from the atheist perspective, God is not real, and therefore he's not infinite, in which case nothing is infinite, in which case can. I don't know how to articulate that any better, but like, if God is the only thing that satisfies that situation, like, it seems like you could never agree on that.
Yeah. So I mean, he's trying to take a concept, right, and then apply it to God, but all we have for analogies are created things in order to sort of grasp around this, right?
I think that's kind of like, a larger problem, right? Trying to, it doesn't fit into my mind, it must be false kind of thing, without like really proving it.
That's ultimately what the issue is, right? Like, that's why 3 is wrong, right? Like, what they really mean is, I can't imagine how a God could be all good and there still be evil, right? So that's like the sort of the evidentiary argument. So there's some of that going on too, where it's. But I think if we go in and we define our terms, we'll be able to. Go ahead.
So is it kind of more of like an inductive argument, like if God exists, then, or if evil exists, then God probably doesn't exist?
Yeah. So this I think would be like the way he's doing is deductive. Although most people, once you sort of tease them a little bit into it, they're like, okay, yeah, I guess some evil has to exist, and then they move to the inductive, and they're like, but there's a lot of evil out there that seems to be unexplained, so therefore it's really probable that God. So most people will, when they begin to see the reason behind it, they kind of shift to the inductive. But I think the way St. Thomas is laying it out is deductive. Connor, do you want to add something, or do you want us to go?
Well, this might be a little bit off. It might be just slowing us down. So, at least for the first part, we try to build the syllogism in that way. So we can imagine, like, if I had something that was contrary to, if I had thing A and thing B, and thing B were thing A, they were completely contrary, so they could not exist together. If one of them was infinite, there'd be no way for this other thing to exist. There'd be no place for it.
Yeah.
So then we can say, okay, the first one's true. Then we say the second one that God is infinitely good. I guess that's the argument he's building up. But it's not like, I guess the reason I want to say that is, it's not like the first one does not come from the fact that we look at light and say, oh, well, with light, there's no darkness. Like, we can consider it, even taking away the God part, just for that one, we can consider it an abstract to actually make it viable.
Right. All right. So C.S. Lewis in The Problem of Pain, he just basically says these 4 things. He says, okay, one of these has to be false. They can't all be true. All right, that's the argument. So God exists, which we've already spent time on. God is all good. God is omnipotent and evil. So we're going to focus on the last 3, and because that's what St. Thomas does, right? So St. Thomas, when he builds the Summa, right, he's already proven that God exists. So he's not interested any longer in this argument that God doesn't exist because there's evil isn't really interesting to him. Okay, because he already knows God exists. He's already proven it. So, all right. So, but he still wants to answer the question of, well, going back to Epicurus' question, where does evil come from? Okay, and he wants to explain it. So that's what we're going to do. So we're really worried about the last 3 of those.
What's the first non-Catholic besides Aristotle?
Maybe this semester, maybe. All right. So let's go after some of these terms. All right. So let's talk a little bit about. Let's talk a little bit about God's goodness, okay? So here's what St. Thomas says. He says, to be good belongs preeminently to God. All right, what does he mean by that? That God is goodness itself, right? And anything that exists is good, and because it shares in God's existence, it shares in God's goodness, all right? Okay. Therefore, since God is the first effective cause of all things, it is manifest that the aspect of good and of desirableness belongs to him, and hence Dionysius attributes good to God as the first efficient cause, saying that God is called good as by whom all things subsist. Okay, so anything that's good, where does it come from?
God.
Okay, why?
Because he is the source of good itself.
Yeah. So remember we talked about, so you have existence, right? God, all of us have existence, right? How do we have existence?
God.
God gives it to us, right? So none of us have existence by nature. Remember we went through the steps of sort of looking, and we said God is pure existence. and we say all things share in his existence, right? And then we say, okay, well, something existing is good. Why do we say that? Well, because goodness is just simply being, existence, looked at from the perspective of the will, looked at from the perspective of being desirable. All right? And so, where was I going with this?
So this Dionysus is very different from Dionysus.
The
Like
philosopher.
drink and be merry kind of.
Yeah. This is like, he's a 2nd or 3rd century Christian philosopher, Dionysius. He's the one who came up with probably a lot of the theology that St. Thomas had with the angels. All right, so we'll make sure we understand what we mean when we say that God is goodness, all right? And we'll talk about why that's important. So he is, everything that exists is good because he gives it existence. Okay? Yes, Con?
Can you define good?
So good is being looked at from the perspective of as desirable. Again, good becomes, remember, because like reality, being, all those things are hard to define because they're transcendental, they transcend categories. But so goodness would be being or existence under the aspect of the will. So what makes things desirable. Right? So we can look at, remember, we can look at being or existence in different ways, right? We can look at it from the intellect, and we call it true. We can look at it from the will, and we call it good. We can look at it from both, where it's this going towards and coming away from, and we say it's beautiful. Okay. Yes, Keegan.
How do you avoid the subjective aspect of that? Because it sounds like you would have to either define, like, whose will is it deemed, like you say, something that exists seen desirable by the will, like, sounds subjective.
Right. Yeah. So that's the. Remember we talked about the different, like the ladder of being. We said some things have more perfections objectively, and we would say from the subjective standpoint that the person has to develop, just like beauty, right, and truth. They have to develop the capacity to see it, right. So they have to get in touch with being as it is and develop the capacity to recognize it. So that's why St. Thomas uses that definition of beauty, right? That which, when seen, pleases. So there is an objective part as well as a subjective, right? Go ahead.
So when we say God is good, we're just, it's not necessarily saying there's something about him, like he's just desirable. Like that's just...
Yeah, like everything desirable is because God has put that, like has put the goodness into it.
This is why transcendental, we say the good is in the thing. It's not.
Yeah. Yeah, our good is not in our evaluation of it. The good is objectively in the thing. It has X amount of good in it. I don't want to, quantify it somehow, but...
Rob, you're 7 good.
7, thank you. I'll go for 11.
Can you address the phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder?
If there's time at the end, I'll get up to it. I don't want to pick us way off.
Did that come up 2 weeks ago, or was that an accident?
Yeah. I think it came up. We can talk more about it at the end if you want. But, all right, so make sure we just understand that when we say that God is good, we don't really mean that he's a nice guy. We mean that he is infinite goodness. He is goodness itself. All goodness, right? Like Christ says, why do you call me good? Only God is good, right? Like God in and of himself is the source of everything that is good. God is the source of it. All right? And you can see why just pinning that down is really important. In just a second. So let's look at omnipotence. What we mean by omnipotence, and we've already talked about this a little bit. We sort of understand that when we say God is all-powerful, kind of what we mean. And we'll say that God can do anything. But it has to be a thing. Right? When we say God can do anything, so God can't make a square circle. Because that's not a thing. Okay? So things that are non-being, things that can't be, are impossible, intrinsically impossible, God can't do because it's nonsense. Okay? Right? Yes?
Is it can't or won't?
Can't. So think about that for a sec. Could, the famous one is, can God create a stone too big for him to lift, right? And that's just nonsense, right? So just because we say God can, and we don't just because you say God can doesn't mean you can put anything after it, right? The thing has to have being, or possibly have being, right? Because remember, so when we talked about in God's mind, right? God knows one thing, himself, right? And then he knows all possible ways in which that goodness can manifest itself in creatures, right? And he chooses one particular path of all of those things. And so goodness and existence can only be manifest in something that could actually exist. So a square circle can't exist. Yes?
This might get us on a really big tangent, but who decides, or what decides, what is able to be?
What decides?
So in a sense, like we say, okay, you can't make a three-sided square or something like that. Three-sided square.
Well, the law of non-contradiction, or the law of contradiction decides it, right? Because a triangle can't both have three sides and have four sides, right? So that can't. It's just the law of contradiction. So remember, the first principles, those reside in God's mind, right? Like, because that is real. That is the way reality is. What were we going to say, Tyler?
Because is that reality that God has defined, or is that just a reality?
That's just the way it is. Like it's just like God. Like just as for all eternity, God is a Trinity. For all eternity, the principle of non-contradiction holds. That's not something that He's drilled into creation. That is the way it is.
So is reality in that sense? Is that part of God? Is that above God, or
God is reality? That is like God, and without getting into like a pantheistic way of looking at it. But God is reality, right? And then He creates in accord with how He really is.
Yeah. I heard someone commenting on this, and he was saying, like, yeah, God is bound by the law of non-contradiction. It's not arbitrary. It's a part of His nature.
Okay.
Yeah. So remember, everything you say about God, like we'll say God is reasonable, but what we really mean is God is reason, right? And so He can't contradict because that's not reason, right? And that's who He is. Okay, what were you going to say, Tom?
I was just going to say that's basically the first principle that you already said.
Okay, yeah. Yes, Con.
Is there a certain amount of, so if we say God is reason, and that means for all existence, even if, I guess God probably thought of a triangle before we did, but even if for all existence, a triangle simply was a triangle, there was no other way you could have a triangle other than the way it is. Does that mean, is there a certain amount of, or is there a certain amount of almost lack of freedom in God says that His nature is in such a way that a triangle has always been a triangle, and you couldn't make it a triangle. You couldn't make a triangle a different way. Part of who He is.
No. So that's important. So God is not by nature a creator, right? He creates, but that's not one of His attributes. That God is not creator. And the reason why that's important, which we're going to get to in a few minutes, we can talk about it now. But the reason why that's important is because He creates under no compulsion. Like it's just an act of the will. So the fact that there are triangles was a decision, a so-called decision of His, because it manifests some part of His goodness in some way.
So this might be
so even the triangle reveals God.
But that mean there could be a world in which we just for some reason could not think of what a triangle is.
Yes. Yeah, a triangle is it's not an eternal thing. It is something that God has. It's in that route of permutation of manifesting His goodness. It's like a cheetah goodness. Yeah. Yes.
Really quick, when you said God was not creator, I initially took that as He's not creating in the sense that He's not creating anything new, and because nothing's new in the sense that it's already in His mind. Or did you mean that a completely different way?
No, I mean it in the sense so God is by nature is love, right? God is existence by nature. God is not creator by nature, right? So just like
how are we defining creator?
Yeah, He's a creator by choice.
That's okay.
Yes,
He's still a creator. He just is not create.
He's not so. We said He was bound to the principle of contradiction because He is reason.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing in creation binds Him. It's a total act of His will.
Okay. It's not essential to His nature to create.
No. So He could have just as easily have not created, right?
But it's
I mean,
not
I think-
contradictory for him to do it.
And it doesn't do anything, like, it doesn't make him any less good or anything like that.
It seems like reality would look a lot different if he was creation, because then, it wouldn't be like, okay, the world has ended, now it's time. Like, he would just keep creating.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? It would be weird.
Like, there would be a compulsion of sorts,
Yeah.
right? Like, where he'd have to do it. He'd have to create. And then the world would have to be a certain way. But when he wills it, like, he's saying, like he does in Genesis, like, this is good, right? Like, he's trying to manifest his goodness and make creatures, free will creatures, like, that could share and comprehend or apprehend his goodness, right? That's his whole plan. Yes, Connor?
So it makes sense, at least makes sense to me to say, okay, I can imagine a world in which I don't exist, I can imagine a world in which beavers don't exist. How do you imagine a world in which an abstract geometric shape doesn't exist? Because it's just the same as like, it seems like we should be able to, reason would be able to discover just by saying, okay, we have those 2 points that makes a line, we have 4 points that makes a square, now if I put 3 points on there, I'm going to be able to draw 3 lines between them.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't, you go ahead, Tyler.
That's based on our experience of how space works. I mean, he could have made space to work like in a different way.
Yeah.
So like, we could be living in like 2300 dimensions, and like, who knows what a triangle would be there.
Yeah. I think you can also maybe, this is a little bit different, but like, when you were 15 years old, you didn't know as much as you know now. Like, maybe there's probably some people in the world today, literally, they don't have a concept of a triangle, or don't have a term for it or whatever, like.
Well, it'd be the concept, right? It doesn't even need to be the term, right? Like, I mean, because it could be called anything. Yeah. What were you going to say?
He could have created it entirely immaterially. At which point, since a triangle, right? The triangle is based on material ideas, and so if he created it entirely materially, there would be no concept of triangle.
I think Tyler's, if we say like, imagine God created a one-dimensional world, then we have no idea how many triangles.
Yeah.
So there could be the hypercube or whatever it is that's 4 dimensions, but we don't have no idea what that is. But even then, we can mathematically.
I'm really scared with this conversation.
The introduction to drawing like a cube in 5 dimensions.
That's what I'm saying.
I really don't understand.
So I had a stat professor that we'd be working on these like surfaces, and he literally told us, no joke, he was straight up, he's like, it has to be a 7-dimensional surface. He's like, I know you all can't picture that, but I can. I was like dead serious. I was like, wow, like that was really like he just went way up.
It's a poor definition of what a dimension is. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. A 4-dimensional thing. At least like what is a 4-dimensional thing look like? But even then, 4 dimensions, we're not in 4 dimensions, or even if, let's say 27 dimensions.
Yeah.
I can't tell you what it looks like, but mathematically, I can say, okay, this is if I take these points and put them on enough axes. That's 27-dimensional cube.
But does that cube exist in reality then? No. Or is it just a mental construct?
I guess it's a mental construct, but this goes back to Casey. Casey gives a figure like triangles don't exist in reality because in reality a triangle is 3 infinitely small points divided by a line, connected by lines that have no width. Well, that doesn't actually exist. It's a compensated idea.
Or like, do numbers like exist on their own? Like, would there be 1, 2, 3? I don't know.
Yeah, well, a new number is just whatever the old number was plus 1, right? So, all right, so before we get like totally like really abstract math,
Extra session.
like I'm not even interested in like geeking out on that, and it just goes a long way. All right, so did God make the best possible world? Kind of not really allowed to answer this question.
Yes.
Find the best possible world.
All right, so is the world that exists the best possible world?
It has to be.
I'm going to say yes.
Why does it have to be?
Because God is all good.
I'm going to say it's in God's nature to aim for the greatest good. He's not going to miss.
A saint said that the greatest gift is the Eucharist. If God could have given us something better, He would have.
All right, so maybe the best possible world has the Eucharist in it. So could there be a world in which free will agents can't sin? Would that be a better world?
No.
I would argue
'Cause they
that
also
this
couldn't
world
love.
is most fitting because that's what God chose to its end.
Okay, so fitting, you're cheating when you now you go in
That's
terms of.
what
Yeah.
I said.
I mean, that's the right answer. But what I want us to think about is the fact that so if God could create a creature with free will that loves but doesn't sin. Okay? There's no like
I mean,
in his
Mary-
omnipotence he could have
Mary was
how about the
that.
people in heaven? Right? So it's certainly possible, right? So remember, this is where we get this is why we're doing this, right? Omnipotence. God can do anything that doesn't involve a contradiction. Is it a contradiction to say that a creature could have free will and not sin?
No.
There's no inherent contradiction in that, right? Because we've seen it.
But it would be a contradiction to say they have free will and it's impossible. Like they don't have the power to sin.
They don't have the power to sin in heaven.
You have to.
Or maybe not.
No, I mean, you can think about a world like, for example, right, where, so remember, free will is ordered to good, right? The good, right? And you could think of a world where the good was so obvious that you choose it every time. Like, so in other words, you don't sin because you're like, I really want to just do my own thing. It's because you see a good, you're wrong about it, and you choose it, right? Because you can't help it. Like, your will is fixed on the good. So, so you can imagine a world where God would maybe make himself really manifest, where it's really obvious, right? And people would automatically always pick the good thing, right?
So
Yes.
are you arguing that that is better?
No, I'm just saying that I mean, it relates to the question of evil, right? So if that is better, but God didn't choose that world, okay?
This is touching on the God is all good part of it.
Yeah. That's where we're sort of going. We're sort of going step by step. Go ahead.
But wasn't God like hyper present with Adam and Eve, yet they still chose sin?
Yeah, what that means about like walking in the garden with them, I don't know that his presence to them was any different than somebody in a like a mystic in a state of grace who can hear God well. Like, I don't think it was necessarily that that they had this overwhelmingly palpable presence of God. I think. Okay. All right. So because ultimately this argument sort of hinges on the fact of that when someone brings this up, they're saying that that there's something defective about this world. Okay. Without really understanding the world itself, right, and why it is the way it is. Okay. Yes.
Can you explain that sentence? For if any one thing was better, the proportion of order would be destroyed.
Yeah. So that's the fitting argument that Keegan was more or less making. So he's saying that all of the good things are in perfect harmony with each other, and we'll talk about why that is in just a second when I get to the next slide. But he's essentially saying too that, like, so if you change one thing, right, like it's like the butterfly effect, right? Like, so suppose I eliminate moral evils. The world is no longer what it is. It's a different world, right? So he's saying, like, you have to be careful when you start thinking about making this world better versus making a better world. And what he's saying is that we can't necessarily know which is the better world, but we can say this world is the best that it can be. Right? That's kind of provocative a little bit, right? So why would he say that? Go ahead, Con.
So I guess so how specific is this? Because I can see a level of specificity where it's like, okay, this is exactly where everything happens this way. This is the best it can be. Like, it's kind of obvious. Like, if everything happens the exact same way, well, of course it's the best it can be because it all happens the exact same way. So you're saying this in terms of given the elements that are in the world right now, it's the best it could be?
I would say from the viewpoint of looking upon the world from like a God's eye view.
Because like all
at once.
Because you could look at it like 1000 BC and say, well, God could have made a world where he was incarnate and died on a cross for our sins, but he didn't.
So it's, remember, like creation is just like it's an act, right? One act. Kind of like step by step by step.
And then what is, I guess, I think you're going to do this, but can you define best?
No, that's the problem, right? Like that ultimate, like it's all like because that's ultimately what they're saying. Like, okay, with evil, the presence of evil in the world makes it not the best, but they can't tell you what the best. Like, we can't tell you what the best is, right? And there's a reason for that. Is because we're not God, right? This is the part where again bumping up to like whether when you go ultimately to the plan of providence, that's when you have to stop, right? God's plan for creation, did he do it the best way possible? Like, and that's where you have to sort of begin to ask the question, right?
So what would you say to someone who said, even though a world without evil would be a different world, it would be a better world because evil is bad?
Yeah, I think we're going to talk about why that. Like, I'm going to answer that question. Like, we're going to sort of at least a little talk about why it fits into the world the way it is.
But looking at the past and like specifically our lives, we can see glimpses into the mind of God, can't we?
Sure.
In terms of like how it really was the best, because then we realize,
Yeah, and I think we can do that on a macro level too, and kind of even from a philosophical standpoint.
So, honestly, with our kind of assumptions going in, we can say, okay, well, we know Christians one act. At the end of the day, that final judgment, God's going to show all this stuff, and we're like, wow, this really was the best. And this might have to go into how Thomas already proved that God exists. He's not really interested in that argument. But when we talk to, if we want to talk to an atheist trying to argue this, they're not going to say, they're not going to like the idea that we're going to say, well, at the end of the day, we'll know it was the best. They're going to say, well, I look around the world now.
Yeah, no, I think we can do better than the end of the day. Like, I really like ultimately like. This is where we begin to slide like a probabilistic part of the argument, right? Like we can't say definitively, but we can show that their premises are wrong, that it certainly is possible that an all good, all powerful, all knowing God could create a world with evil, and here's how it makes sense. And according to the Catholic conception, this is how it actually is. So the whole goal is to show them that their line of reasoning is wrong, right? That you can actually make a world like that. Like you can still say God is all good, all powerful, and there still be evil, and here's how. Okay, so that's the end goal, right? Not to say like, that you just gotta wait till the end. You gotta have faith. Like I think we can do better than that. All right, so then the first step now in that process to start moving towards is to say, well, what's God's plan? Why did He create it? All right, so why did God create it?
Love.
Okay, give me more than just love.
Existence is good.
All right, so to manifest His goodness, how does He do that?
Creation.
Okay, creating a couple things, many things.
Every day of creation, He saw that it was good.
Yeah, so multiple things. Like, Keegan, you can't cheat. So he creates a multitude of things. Why a multitude?
Because no one can express Him fully.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they'd be Him.
Many things can express it fully.
Okay.
Express it fully.
No, but that's like what He wants to reveal, right? So in other words, yeah, the more things there are, the more closely they can manifest His goodness, but they will never, ever approach fully. Right?
So then why aren't there more things?
Yeah. That's the question. That's part of the plan of providence, right? Like how many things, right? So remember again, what is providence basically? Providence is that sort of that the plan of the mind of God, in that He has all these different ways, this matrix of ways to manifest His goodness, right? Of all these different creatures, and He picks the one that, like, if you guys want to get into math again, like maximizes the manifestation of His goodness, and that's His plan, all right? And that's the plan. That's the way it'll go.
Is there an infinite set of possibilities, or is it finite?
It would be infinite because God is infinite, right? Like His infinite goodness, there's an infinite number of ways you could manifest it.
So then, okay, so like, kind of starting here, like, Mary is infinitely inferior to God, but immensely superior to every other creature. Does Mary or any of the other creatures ever? They don't ever, like, they share in the infinite of God, but they don't ever have any of that on their own, right?
Yeah.
Like you see what I'm saying? Like, kind of how do you?
Yeah,
How does that fit in?
begin to think about like
I guess my question is like in math, you can have infinite and then like more infinite. Like this, they're both infinite, but this one's like better infinite.
I think we talked about this where like don't get caught up on the math definition.
Okay,
of infinite,
okay.
Right, like math definition infinite is just something it approaches. Right, with God, it really is infinite. Yes, Connor.
So what you said, talking about this. Sorry, I'm talking about math. This matrix of possibilities.
Oh boy.
Earlier you said okay, we can't say that this is the best possible world. We just know it's the best possible of this world. Doesn't if we say that God had this matrix of possibilities and He picked one, doesn't that kind of seem to remove that assumption that He looked at all the possible worlds and picked this one?
Yeah. So that's from the mind of God, and we can know that. Like, but that would be a faith thing rather than. Like I can't prove that. I can show why providence is reasonable, and even to show like an omniscient God has to have who creates has to have providence. But to go like nitty gritty and say that He has to pick this world the way it is, I don't know that we can prove that.
So I guess we know He picked a way, and we know that's. And we say it's fitting that He picks the way that most manifests His goodness, or He had to pick the one that most.
No, because remember, it's all like His.
Had, I guess, in the sense that He would pick the one that is.
Yeah. So the necessity is in the fact that once He decided to create, like so it's like somebody hates when I use this term, but contingently necessary.
I love when you use that.
Yeah. Somebody else doesn't like it. Okay. So. All right, so He creates in a way to most. Yes. Okay.
So basically, what you said is God created the world so that His, in a way that would maximize how His goodness is manifested. So, but why did He have to do something to manifest His goodness? Like, what was the motive?
Yes, see, because there's a second half of this equation that everyone's forgetting, right? So and to have creatures who can share and appreciate it. Right? So that's why, like, humans and every other, animate or even inanimate material object, are on totally different levels, right? So all of those things are for us to know God's goodness, right? So just to manifest His goodness, like, He doesn't, like, it's not like it's an ego trip and He's like, I'll just see what I can do here. But no, because He wants the people to know. The ones He invites to share in His eternal life, He wants them to see the goodness. Yes,
is it possible to like give an analogy for that? Like, I mean, in the sense that so basically what you're saying is, if God is good, and then God is good, that's like one statement. The next statement is He is good, and He wants someone else to share in that goodness, and that is necessarily better than He being good by Himself and not doing anything about it.
No. He loves His goodness so much. And think about it. So the good just naturally diffuses itself, right? Like when you get good news, what do? You want to tell someone, right? Like it's just the nature of goodness itself to diffuse itself. So you have to like make sure, like what you're saying makes sense, and as long as you don't make it seem like it was necessary that He did that. Like He just did that because He wanted to. Because He wanted to share, He wanted creatures He could share His goodness with, right? So, I mean, think analogously, like a married couple when they have a child, right? What motivates them to have a child? Like, you already know the answer to this, right? Like, there's love here. I want to share that with something, with someone, in an appropriate and fitting way. It's a child, right? This child is there, right? So it's like the love taking flesh, right? So God's goodness takes flesh because it's good.
So is it like a natural end towards which goodness would ultimately converge?
Yes, but once it's been created, right? So even in the world, right, goodness just tends to spread, right? Like think about it, like it just when there's good somewhere, it just kind of has this habit of spreading out, right?
But does goodness necessarily mean that? Does the fact that God is good necessarily mean that He would have to create?
No, He does that completely like free will. Just I want to do this.
So it's possible that God can be good and not create.
Yeah. So it doesn't add anything to Him, right? So remember, we're back to like God is like perfectly happy as God. He doesn't need anything else, right? And this is like the sheer, we can't even imagine this, right? And we'll talk about it in the end when we talk about God's suffering. We can't imagine, this is where we begin to limp, we can't imagine just doing something out of sheer gratuitousness, like with no self-interest whatsoever. We just do it because that's what good does. Like, and you do get a glimpse of it when you have a child, right? You're like, there's no reason, like, in the grand scheme of things, like, why would we do this? Like, they're a pain. They mess up my stuff. They spend my money in college. Like, all of those things, right? Where you just, like, accept it. You're like, no, like, our love has to take flesh and be walking around. Because that's what it does. That's what love does. It can't just be bottled up, right? And, we can't invite someone else into our marriage, but we can like, have a third. Yes?
In that this is what he did, he wouldn't have done anything else because he didn't. It's not like he decided.
No. So even now I'm limping with understanding that it's an act of the will that God made, that he didn't just like one morning wake up and decide, right? I don't want to go too deeply. Like, I don't want to get it. It's like we could go off into God's will like forever, right? And still never grasp it. And I don't want to do that necessarily.
God is completely free. So does that mean that he doesn't have to do anything?
In the sense that he doesn't have to do anything outside of himself. So the Father has to eternally generate the Son, because that's the nature of God. But like, add extra outside of them, they don't have to do anything. Go ahead, Keith.
This might be like more distracting, but it might also help. Looking at like angels, how did God manifest His goodness to them? Did He, or
like through the manifest His goodness to them or through them? Which one?
To them. So thinking like in their creation, like whenever we say like their decision was made, like did He manifest His goodness to them, and if so, like how?
Yeah, and it would be like, again, we have to be careful not to get into like the plan B of like humanity, but it would be through their infused knowledge, right? So that their angels are given an infused knowledge of something, and that something is really of God because it manifests something of His goodness.
So rather than manifesting Himself in a material way where we can come to understand, it was just infused.
Yeah.
This might be beyond what you can explain, but does that mean like an angel?
Are you putting limitations on your
Does that mean an angel got like? I mean, this might sound kind of silly, but it does sound silly. Does that mean one angel? Like, let's just take.
I like how you're still going to say it anyway.
The lowest guardian angel, the lowest guy. Does that mean he just got like a dog and he's like, "Here, I'm manifesting my goodness through a dog," and you now? Or is it something more abstract than that?
It's probably not. I mean, is there a guardian angel that has a share in God's knowledge of the dog? Specifically. Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
I guess taking that perhaps a little less silly. When you say infused knowledge, was it? I mean, it couldn't have been. It wasn't the beatific vision because then they couldn't have fallen. So it was knowledge of something external, or at least not.
Yeah. So comprehensive knowledge. Like, remember how we can only apprehend, we can't comprehend of something.
Yeah.
So that, like, if it really was a dog, say, like that angel knows, like, has a share in God's knowledge of dogness, so that he can see through it and see not only God's goodness in it, but see every particular dog that's ever been created through that. If that makes sense.
So it's not like he would have a human understanding of a dog infused without ever having a dog, but he would understand the concept and how.
Yeah, he would understand how it fit into God's plan, everything, like the whole picture of dog, right? And that's why the angels, like, that's why they have like certain, like, that's the way they are, right? So that particular angel might be lower than the one who has the same. I'm getting probably stupider now, but has the same kind of knowledge of an ape, because an ape is more intelligible, and so forth and so on. So his knowledge is actually higher, because his knowledge would in some way include the knowledge of the dog.
But then that angel looked at the dog and said, and from that knowledge, he made the decision: I'm either going to serve God or I'm going to not serve God.
Well, yeah. So remember, like what he's seeing is not the dog, but the goodness of God through the dog, right? And so that's what he's making a decision about, right? And you know what the actual it's probably more than that too, but that's his we all have experiences of God's goodness, right? Like that's his experience of God's goodness. All right.
So do the angels have like complete knowledge of all creation except for the free will stuff, or is there more that they don't know? Like does every angel know every other angel perfectly, kind of thing?
No. So like the lower angels wouldn't know the higher angels.
They don't know they exist, or they don't know.
No, they don't know them
that well, or
comprehensively.
They're acquaintances.
Yeah.
They're kind of like, oh, I know that they're there, and I know some things about them.
So there's an example of this in the book of Daniel where this guardian angel, I think it's Daniel, he's calling the guardian angel, and the guardian angel comes 5 days later, and he's like, "What in the world took you so long?" He's like, "Oh, well, Michael was holding me back because Michael's a higher angel, so he has to wait for Michael to give him the go ahead for whatever reason." Because Michael has more knowledge of what God is doing versus what that angel did. And we can certainly talk about that if we do end up doing angels. I don't want to get too stuck in angels.
Yeah, but wait, did you say that came from the book of Daniel?
I think it's in the book of Daniel. I could be wrong about it. It's one of the prophets where he's talking about where he's talking to this angel, and the angel said, "Michael held me back."
So, at the final judgment, do we gain a knowledge of the entire path that God picked at that point, or still no?
Maybe. I mean, I don't see why not, right? I don't see, because we'll be able to judge ourselves, right? So of course we have to know where how we.
And so, philosophically speaking, why does there have to be one path instead of do one and then do the other, or do them all at once, or do everything? You see what I'm saying?
Because you're receiving being along that path, you're receiving more being of yourself. God has one image of you in His mind as to what you are supposed to be, so it's one path to that. Even though it feels like multiple paths because it's coming in time. All right, so evil. All right, so everything we've said now, let's sort of go where St. Thomas goes, all right? So he's not that interested in proving the existence of God through this, but he is sort of interested in exonerating God, okay? So let's talk a little bit about what evil is, and we've already talked about this a little bit. Evil means the displacement of a good. So evil is, what did we say good was? Good was being. So a lack of goodness is a lack of being, right? So can God create evil? Why not?
Because you can't create the uncreated.
Yeah, it's not. Evil is not a thing. It can't be created. Okay, evil exists. This is why we have to qualify it, right? Because we all experience it, right? But it has no being.
But isn't it more
What's the difference?
It's not just non-being, but it's non-being where there should be being.
What do you mean?
Like a
four-sided triangle is not evil.
No, because it's not proper to a triangle.
Yeah, so it's
it is non-being, but it's not evil.
Right. Yes, this is what he's talking about when he says you have to take a privation versus a negation. So for a duck not to talk, that's a negation, but not an evil. But for me not to talk, is
you're
an
saying
evil.
I should be talking a lot.
Yeah. So the example that St. Thomas always uses is blindness, right? Where he says, blindness. Does blindness exist?
Yes.
Does it have any being? Is it something? No, it's a lack of something, right? It's a lack of sight. Okay. Why does it matter that we split hairs like that?
Because evil's not an opposite of good; it's a lack of good.
Yes, and so God. So what we're trying to show is that God doesn't create evil. That's what he's ultimately trying to show.
Because it can't be created.
Yeah, it's not something created. It's a lack of something.
It's like dark is not the opposite of light. Dark is the lack of light.
Yes.
Or
You
is
can't.
the lack
How
of
do you
light.
create darkness?
Extinguish the candle.
You don't, right? You just there's no more light, it's gone, right? So it's there's a hole in a sock. Does that exist? Yeah. Yes, but what is it?
It's a lack of socks.
A lack of socks, right? Okay. All right. So we're kind of clear, right? All right. So make sure that we understand that. Make sure we don't say evil doesn't exist, because it does exist, but it has no being. Okay. So when God if God is all good, and He can't pour His goodness into one thing, then it certainly is possible for Him to make something which doesn't have the fullness of its being, right? Without being not all good and not all powerful. No, we're just talking about possibilities here. Go ahead, Keith.
Can we define evil again? I don't know if you have yet.
Yeah. So evil is just a lack of a good that should be there.
Is it a complete lack of a good?
No, it can be a lack of the good of. I could have astigmatism in my eye, right? I can still see. Okay. So St. Thomas would say that the astigmatism is evil. We normally use it in moral terms, but he's just saying any evil is just a lack of a good that should be there. So I should have 20/20 vision.
So is that should be there an important part of it?
Yeah. That's that qualifying point is that's the hinge on it, right?
Yeah, I think that's what I was saying.
Yeah. So like a rock, the fact that a rock can't see is not evil.
Is it evil to have something you shouldn't have?
Yes.
How, if that's more existence? Some humans are born with the tail thingy.
Yeah. Yeah. So
or 6 fingers.
To have something that you shouldn't have, what's not proper to your nature, is still a negation of the order of your nature.
So it's something not being there, and the something that's not there is nothing.
Yeah. So no, it's not nothing. It's a thing, right? But it's evil in the sense that it does not properly. You could even go further, right? You could normally it's in a negation of the goodness. So the goodness of human nature is less in one with a tail, in a person with a tail. Again, it's not a moral that's just looking at it ontologically. Yes.
So then, in terms of measuring how good or evil a person is, are we measuring that relative to the person's capacity or relative to God? So if I said, because obviously we are not perfectly good compared to God, so does that make us all evil, or are we measuring or making a statement of our own good based on how good we
we have to be,
as Andrew?
Yeah, we have to be careful not to equivocate when we're using good and evil to always go to a moral judgment. Right? So St. Thomas, because for God, right, does God have virtues?
Probably not.
No, so to even begin to think about to make a moral judgment on God is a little odd to begin with, right? But a person who has more virtue than another person has fuller being, and that's why we say, oh, he's a good person, right? And what we really mean is that he's morally better than the average person walking around or whatever. Did that answer your question?
Sort of. I
Do
guess
you want to
we're
go deeper? Go ahead.
So we're defining, with a person, again, I know we shouldn't be judging people, but as a hypothetical. So are you judging this person is good and this person is evil in relation to each other, or are we doing it in relation?
You would judge them in relation to Christ.
Okay.
Who's the perfect human. Mm-hmm. Right? So the more Christ, I can safely say the more Christ-like someone is, the better they are.
Okay.
Yes.
But the only reason we're saying they should be like Christ is because Christ was the perfect man.
Yes. Yeah.
So really, you could say that you're judging them in accordance with human nature.
Yeah, you wouldn't judge against St. Michael. You wouldn't judge someone against St. Michael.
Do you have a flaming sword?
All right. So yes, Ronan.
Can you repeat what you said before we had the questions about God is good and all powerful, but can still create something that is lacking something?
Yeah. So God can create. So in other words, He can create. Say He created Adam, right?
Yes.
Adam had everything he needed to fulfill his nature, but God doesn't create it such that his nature is fulfilled, right? And so, we wouldn't necessarily. So God leaves it so that Adam has to do certain things to fulfill himself, right? And He puts things in his path to do that, right? And so Adam can either order his acts to that, or disorder them, and the disorder would be evil.
So fulfill his potential mean fulfill his nature. That's what I said, right? Means reach his full potential.
Yeah, becomes like Christ, right? And Adam is a great example of that, right? Because he failed to be like Christ,
Okay.
right?
So that's the lack of completeness that
Yes.
we see in creation.
No, so initially, no. That's the lack of completeness that we see as a result of the fall, right? So Adam had everything he needed, and in that respect, there was no moral evil there to stop him from doing it. He's the one who introduces disorder into that.
So what did he lack? He had everything he needed, but
Yeah, well, he had everything to fulfill his nature. He had to finish the job.
Okay.
So he like the virtue of courage, right? He had the virtue of courage. He was given it by God, but he didn't have it to the degree that Christ had it, and so he failed when confronted by the serpent.
But he could theoretically, it was possible for him to achieve it.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, God didn't set him up to fail. So yeah. And so the fact that God gives, that's why we say God is just, not because he gives what everyone's owed, but the fact that he creates and then gives everything to that creature to fulfill themselves.
I think this seems like, I don't know, maybe like an important point, because it's like, I don't know. I mean, for ourselves, knowing that, we're not done yet, it's kind of hard. Knowing that we have problems is hard. And even some of the more true but controversial teachings of the church, if you have homosexuality, that's a disorder. Someone would have a hard time with that because, it's like we almost want to think that the world's going to tell us, oh, you're fine just the way you are, and that's it. But God's like, no, no. I want you to be way better. You're not done yet.
And that's the evil of the spirit of the world, right? So the person with homosexual inclinations, what they really need to hear about is that the power of the cross can heal that, right? And the world will rob the cross of its power and say, oh, no, you're fine how you are, right? I'm okay, you're okay is an offense against the cross, right? The cross can do all of that.
This is a hard teaching. Who can believe
it? Yeah. But if you listen to the world, then of course you're going to think everything is, I'm really okay. All right, so St. Thomas, as we talked about, is more sort of interested in exonerating God from responsibility for evil. Okay, but we've got to now sort of drill down and talk a little bit about what we mean by evil specifically. Yes, Todd?
Can we first talk about what we mean by exonerating?
Yeah. So God is. I probably should put this, and it sort of is in this slide. So God is the cause of everything, right? Everything that has being, God is the cause of. All right. So the question is God the cause of evil? Okay. And so we're going to break evil into sort of categories, and we're going to look at why he's not the cause in either case. All right. So we said evil has non-being, and so he can't be. But now we're going to show why that's true. Okay. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So we haven't really exonerated them yet. We're getting there. Okay. Go ahead, Tom.
What does the word exonerate mean?
Yeah, okay. So you know it was just kind of squeezed in there. So exonerate is just simply saying he's innocent.
Okay.
Yeah. That was awesome. He's like, wait, he's trying to, I hope he says it what it means. Okay. All right, so we're gonna break evil down into two categories: evil suffered and evil done, or physical evils versus moral evils. All right, so this book, by the way, the reason why I put one of the quotes in there, this Dominican priest from England, his name is Brian Davis, even though it's spelled Davies, but he's British. So, anyway, he has a book called The Reality of God and the Power of Evil, in which he basically drills down on what St. Thomas teaches, which if you really want to dive into it, is an excellent resource. All right, so we have evil suffered only when we have goodness curtailed by goodness. right? And we're going to talk about what this means. Or to put it another way, there is always concomitant good when it comes to evil suffered. For evil suffered only occurs as something thrives at the expense of something else. All right, so what does he mean? Go ahead.
Why does it have to be physical evil?
It's just the way we categorize it. Like, so physical evils are evils that are outside of, that don't have a moral cause to them. Think of them that way.
Like sadness.
Yeah, or like
Earthquakes.
I mean, economic inequality, is that an example? Maybe?
No, that would have probably a moral component. No, don't think human. Think just like the lamb being eaten by the lion. That's a physical evil.
I guess my question would be, couldn't this also apply to moral evils in the sense that the person might be choosing, not necessarily might not be performing a morally good act, but is pursuing a thing that they perceive as good?
Well, that's just the definition of will, right? Like the will can't not choose. So I think you would very loosely be able to talk about a moral evil like this. I think we can define it clearer, I think. Yes, please.
Why is the lion eat the lamb evil?
Okay, so that's going to be the question, right? All right, so from the lamb's perspective, kind of more than just sucks, right? Like it's an evil, right? So the fact that the lamb ceases to exist, right? But what St. Thomas says and what Father Davies is saying is that actually those are just two good things colliding into each other, right?
So is it not actually an evil?
Yeah, so he's saying that these physical evils in and of themselves aren't evil at all, right? Because, and it even goes, St. Thomas uses the example of when Moses' sister gets leprosy. He's like, well, the virus itself, it was just acting the way in which it's meant to act, right? And that's how it acts on a host. And that is a good thing. And it collided with the good that was Miriam's health. And for whatever reason, that good won out, right? So it's not as clear there when it's human, when we're talking about a human versus like non-human, but animal to animal, that the lion eating the lamb is not an evil. Right? It's just the lion's self-preservation meeting the lamb's self-preservation, and the lamb getting the short end of the stick.
But isn't the reason that the animals are killing each other and the spider's eating its children and all that because of the fall?
No. It's the nature of the world, right? Like what I just said would be true. And that's this quote. That's why I went up. So death enters human history with the fall, right? So death entering human history with the fall. There was still death before, because otherwise we have to then go, well, what's all this in the fossil record? Those look dead to me, right? So so the fact that animals die and that like lambs are naturally predated by lions is just the nature of the world. Because guess what? The nature of a material world means what? There's limitation, and there's always going to be like thriving bumping into each other, right? Like the lion is naturally going to. What would the lion eat otherwise?
Yeah, yes.
Right. Yeah.
If nobody ate anything, it would just be like a frozen
I
world.
mean,
Nothing would happen.
So the world is the way it is. So no matter what, even if we weren't moral agents, if I wanted to sit in that chair and you wanted to sit in that chair, one of us is not sitting in the chair. That's an evil, right? From your perspective. Even though we're both seeking the good of sitting down. So that's just the nature of material world. Yes, Keith?
I don't really know how to phrase this, but like, are there physical evils that are actually evil? Like, aside from the moral component, not necessarily without it, but like
no. So the evil would be in the way it's experienced, right?
Okay.
And like the lamb would experience that as an evil because it's now it has a lack of being.
Okay.
If it could experience a lack of being, whatever that means, right? But if I get my arm eaten off by the lion, there's now an evil in the sense that I'm lacking my arm. But there's no evil in the sense that that's what lions do.
Would it be fair to say that like physical evil is things like you could just recall it like temporal evil, in which case like it matters. It does not matter in any way in the spiritual realm, like in the divine scales of justice.
Well, no. So God even that does it for the good of the whole. So like the plan of like lions chasing lambs, it's still governed by providence in the sense that the lambs won't go cease to exist. because the lions have overhunted them or something. And again, that's me putting the plan of providence because maybe the lambs are supposed to go. But I'm just saying in general, like it's all like there's a common good. Think of it as a common good of within God's plan to manifest all of His goodness, so that He does. It does have bearing somehow. We don't know exactly how.
Would that be the same as saying, like, so in my head I've always described it as temporal evil versus like spiritual evil and good?
Yeah, I think that's evil done versus evil suffered. I think is what temporal evil would be. Evil suffered.
Right. So then would it be? It almost sounds like what you're saying is like, yes, the temporal evils or temporal goods can like affect the spiritual good and the spiritual evil, but at the end of the day, like these don't matter on divine scales, or that they do it only in the context that they affect these.
Yeah, only in the sense that they affect a person, right? So how I respond to the lion eating off my arm would have profound, like if I go, well, I spin into depression and I hate God forever because of it, versus Thy will be done, right? So only in that respect. So they become means, right? Because everything is a means, right? Everything God does is a means to bring us into eternal communion. Okay? So you don't want to set them like so far apart that they don't like the temporal versus spiritual don't interact. But there's definitely a hierarchy, right? And insofar as evil touches us, it should have a spiritual effect upon us. Go ahead.
So, just going back to the lion and lamb. The lion is pursuing the good of surviving. The lamb is also pursuing the good of surviving. The lamb, we can truly say the lamb suffers a physical evil in the sense that it is killed. But the act of the lion eating the lamb is good. Not morally, because it's not like the lion.
Yes.
It's just
No, because it preserved the goodness of its being, right? And that's God's plan, right?
But how much can we say? I said, to what granularity is providence? Do you know? So, how granular can we give a providence? Like, can we say? And I have no problem with the other. I'm really fine with saying like the raindrop that falls, and every raindrop God is, guiding down. But like, can we say that is to that degree?
Yeah, well, I mean, we could say it philosophically, right? Because how does that raindrop exist? God is holding it. Like, God just didn't create the raindrop and stop, right? He's actually holding it in existence. He's holding that water molecule together and holding it in existence.
But couldn't we also say that water molecule, in the course of being, we trace back its life, was because some guy, out of course, God will decide to push his friend into a puddle, and then move the water a little bit over, that caused it to be absorbed a little bit more to the left, and then it fell a little bit more to the left than it normally would.
Yeah, but it only fell to the left because God held it in existence. It only was raised up because God, this is why we always have to make sure we understand the fact that God is being itself really has to do with now, and that we're never out of His sight, right? Philosophically, not just theologically. We're never out of His sight, because if we were, we wouldn't exist. We'd cease to exist. So the raindrop falling where it falls, God willed it when He willed the act of creation. So He holds it in existence according to the plan that He set out.
But He only passively wills sin. Or not.
Well, we'll talk about that in a second.
Okay.
Yes.
But God primarily works through the material world through secondary causes. So the raindrop falling where it did happened because of the world God is holding in being, not because He chooses every single raindrop to fall.
Yeah, so not to get caught up in that, right? So I don't want to get into this occasionalism where the raindrop only falls where it is because God pushes it there. Right?
Yeah.
You could trace it back, and maybe can we predict where water's going? I don't know, but in some ways, He's still operating according to predictable in a predictable manner. But nevertheless, it's not like there's any, I think to Connor's point, nothing is inconsequential.
So say I'm walking along the road, and for whatever reason a raindrop lands on my nose and incredibly changes my life. We would say it's providence, whether or not God.
Yeah, we tend to always say providence when it's a positive thing, but it could be.
But I guess I meant more it's providence, whether or not God changed the world for it. Like the world operating in the way He intends it to is providence.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say God changed the...
I guess miraculously. Say he shifted the raindrop.
Yeah, but even that is within the plan of providence, right? Like,
yeah,
him acting in a way that is different from like the way we normally predict that he'll act with the things like him making something, like rather than just holding in existence, he becomes an efficient cause of something.
But okay, so I guess just the miraculous and the non-miraculous are all.
Yeah, so the rain fell like it did because that's what raindrops do, right? They have this inner thing that, like, I don't want it to seem like God is like everything is like he's pushing everything everywhere. Like it fell where it did but it didn't fall that way without him having a plan for it to fall that way.
Okay.
That's my point.
So is this where we're getting on to formal, material, final, and efficient causes of why the raindrop fell?
I mean, we could do that, right? So, but that would be
Another 30 minutes.
Well, but I guess that's what you're saying is like, okay, we can look at the raindrop falling and say, well, formally God created the raindrop this way. Materially, the clouds and the water rains and stuff this way. But the final cause, God, from all creation, knew He was going to make raindrops fall the way they did because of He knew at this moment that raindrop was going to fall.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so remember, like a final cause doesn't have to just be one thing, right? So the final cause of the raindrop is to water the ground. But we always have to go, when we talk about final cause, we always have to get to the point of its final cause was to manifest God's goodness. As long as we do that, right? And something will fit in there, right? Like maybe it is just, it fell where it fell because it landed on the farm and the person had been praying for rain because there was a drought, whatever. Like, but the point is that nothing happens outside of His plan. And how He brings it about, there's secondary causes that can be predicted and all that, but still. Okay? All right, so that's evil done. All right, so let's talk a little bit about moral evil. All right, so we kind of agree that like a physical evil in and of itself, probably we wouldn't call it evil, right? We would say it's just two goods bumping into each other. All right, so let's talk about when someone commits a moral evil. Okay, and so we'll sort of define them. So we're trying to say that God is not the cause of that, right? Because is God the cause of my free will? Okay. Is God the cause of what I do with my free will?
Yeah.
Because if He's the cause of what I do with my free will, then that becomes problematic, right? Because then He is on the hook for whatever I do with it. All right, so maybe an example will help with what St. Thomas uses, okay? What causes a limp? Is it the power to walk, or is it a defect in the leg? Okay, but without the power to walk, the limp wouldn't manifest itself, right? Okay, so now we can sort of apply that to free will. So God gives us the power to choose freely, but it's us who chooses. Okay. All right. Otherwise, if we don't do that, then God sort of ends up somehow like beholden to our free will decisions, right? So He ultimately gives the power to choose freely, all right? And He uses that just like He uses the power to a power of gravity to cause certain things within the plan of providence. He uses the power of free will to cause certain things. Like He just uses it as a cause, like He does everything else. Okay, as a secondary cause. All right. So we would say that God doesn't make the person act, but gives them the power to act. Just like the power to walk doesn't cause the limp, but a defect in a leg. Okay, so then go ahead.
So if God gives power to somebody such that he or she is able to choose good and evil, then He is in some way responsible for giving that person the potential to choose something wrong that would affect.
Yes. So in sort of a secondary way, God is, because He gave that person and He's holding them in existence, in a secondary way, I don't want to say responsible because that's not the word I really want to use, but He is a cause of what that person does. And I'm using cause in a very loose way. And we'll see why in just a second. Go ahead, Connor.
We'd also say God doesn't make us able to choose good and evil. God makes us able to choose good, but then our lack of knowledge or weakness of will lets us choose evil, or causes us to choose evil.
Yes, right? So even when we choose something that's evil, there's a good attached to it. So that's what our will is attaching to, right? We just disorder it in some way, right? Like, I don't know, the person who steals something, right? It is good that they desire some good thing, right? But they obtain it in some disordered way. Okay, and the evil comes in the disordered way in which they obtain the good. All right. All right. So does that make sense?
So it's like we are only wired to choose something good for ourselves, but we are confused or whatever, so we don't necessarily choose it the way we should.
Exactly.
So what does the command not to covet the neighbor's goods mean then? If it's good to have the desire.
Well, I mean, so coveting your neighbor's good doesn't mean that you don't like what they have, right? I mean, it's deeper than that, right? Like to covet their goods is like to say, like, I want that, they shouldn't have that, or to be jealous of them. But if the object is, I mean, if the object of your desire is the object itself, like, I don't know, like my neighbor has a toilet in their house, and I'm like, that would be good to have in my house. That's not covering their goods, right? Like, I'm like, that's an objective good. I'm not going to take your toilet, but I'm going to get a toilet of my own, right? To go and take your toilet would then be to covet his goods, or to steal, or whatever, right? So it's disordered. So the natural desire to have a toilet is a good thing, but you introduce disorder in the way you obtain it. So that's actually, I think, is probably a good example.
Kind of, can you resolve this for me? So God is in complete control of reality, and we have free will, and there's no contradiction there, but it seems like there is.
Okay. So in what way? So tease it out a little bit, and then I can fill in the blanks.
So it would seem that the only way God can really control reality with respect to our free will is like if we were about to do something, I don't know, that he didn't want to be the next step, then he would have to like make a real hard shift, or I don't know, like
why would he
smite us out of existence, or
why couldn't an all good and all powerful God just bring about the good he was going to bring about through it anyway?
Yeah. I mean,
so that's what I mean about treating it as a means. It's a means. We introduce complications when we talk about free will. From God's perspective, it really is no different than the sawmill using like water and gravity to power it or something. So it's just one more means that God uses to bring about the good he was going to bring about anyway. So God has to remain like outside of it. Like he can't be dependent upon our decisions, unless he's decided that it's going to be brought about by a secondary cause, and then he can say, well, it's either contingent or necessary. So there might be a necessary time where he goes, I better hit Kevin with a lot of grace because this path goes this way, so that he actually sees. Because remember, God, as long as you know what the good is, you will always choose it, right? Mm-hmm. And so grace can illuminate your mind and say that is really good, Kevin, and your will will naturally gravitate to it. It'll be you who chooses, but God is pointing. Like it's just like someone saying, like you're trying to think about something, and you're like, oh, do I want the banana pudding or the ice cream? And someone comes along and goes, the ice cream's terrible. And then you choose the banana pudding. Did they force your hand?
No.
No, right?
You just trusted them.
You still choose, right? I mean, you still chose, right? And so that's how God can affect your decisions to go, that's a good, and then you go, yeah, I want the good. I'll go get it.
When you are making someone an offer that they can't refuse, are you taking away their free will?
No, because assuming they still have to choose it, right? Like, I mean, in a Godfather sense, like maybe like, they would say it's not maybe that's not a moral,
because that's kind of like borderline. It's like, are they really choosing if it's such an obvious choice?
Like if they can really choose, then yes.
I'm thinking of car salesman. It's like, if I offer you a Camaro for like $5, like, I'm not taking away your free will. I'm just making you a really good deal.
Yeah. But if it's like it can be forced, so there's no longer a free decision. Yes. Right. Like someone could say shoot this person, and I say no, and they pick up my hand and make me move. I didn't shoot them. Right. It was just a physical act. So I guess it depends on what you mean by like an offer you can't refuse.
But like when you say you are giving him so much grace that it becomes very obvious that this is the truth.
Yeah, so grace always illumines or strengthens the will. So it always illumines, actual grace illumines the mind to say, oh, that's really good. Or strengthens the will to make you actually bind to it and stick to it.
So when you are given that much grace, is it possible that you can still choose the bad?
Sure. I mean, because it's still you that chooses, right?
Well, hypothetically. But
Yeah, but you wouldn't. Like, it's like saying, like, okay, the choice is for you to walk into this room that really has a pitfall in it, versus go into this room which has your birthday cake in it. Like, now that you know both things, you wouldn't walk in the room B, right? You just wouldn't do it because it's not good. Like, and you'll just go, that's not good, that is good, I want the good, because that's what human beings do.
So then, like, people who sin or go to hell just needed more grace? Like,
well, so this is where you get into the plan of providence, right? Because you can become immune to it. This is what I was saying about, like, it's still, even if you don't respond to grace, like, someone who's holier only they don't even need actual grace, right? Because they're illuminated by the gifts of the Holy Spirit, right? The Holy Spirit indwelling in them, and they're so united to God, they just do whatever. They just do what is good every single time, right? But did the person need more grace?
When you say that they wouldn't go into a room that they knew, that becomes Socrates, like intellectual, like, if I knew that it was wrong, I wouldn't choose it. But, like, we see that actually happens.
Yeah, so grace doesn't always, like, make it that. I'm just using it as an extreme example, right? Like, grace will maybe nudge you towards it. Or once you come to the decision on your own, it strengthens your will to actually stick to your guns. So it doesn't operate like exactly how I'm describing it. But it doesn't just overcome ignorance. It doesn't just strengthen the will. It can do either one, right?
It just seems like what you're saying is the reason that we sin is from a lack of grace, not a lack of, or not in of our choice.
In the sense that we're fallen, that's it. I mean, grace is necessary to avoid sin completely, right?
Yes, but it is not I could be wrong. From my understanding, it's not a lack of grace that leads us to sin. It's our own choice to turn away from that grace.
Yes, but it doesn't always mean the grace is there either. So, like, that's why I want to
You're
get.
saying, I think if there's enough grace, we wouldn't sin.
That's what it sounds like when you say, if you know that the cake's in this room, you wouldn't.
Yeah, but I guess I'm kind of making it extreme.
I'm still really confused with the whole free will thing. So it's
Yeah, but like,
fault, but
I chose free will.
Yeah, maybe we should curb the free will question, and only stick to it just insofar as we just sort of accept that grace and free will cooperate, and we can talk about that another time because we can talk all day long about this. Go ahead, Steve.
So, yeah, I referenced the case earlier. Someone recently brought up, like, Molinism. Are you familiar with, like, Molinism versus Thomism?
Vaguely.
It just, right, because we're getting into the topic of, like, Abraham with the sacrifice of Isaac, and he made a comment that I was not a big fan of. I was like, well, like we have to cooperate with that grace. It's not like Abraham is passive in that. And he's like, well, that kind of depends on, like, whether you take the Thomist approach or the Molinist approach or whatever. So, like, in my head...
So what was his explanation?
I'm going to read up on it.
Okay.
It wasn't the common place for it. But just based on the equivocal thing that I read, it sounded like Molinism is what I would say is correct, where it's like grace presents you the opportunity, grace strengthens you to choose the good, and then you choose it of your own accord, and then if you chose the right, you get grace granted to you. And it says that stands in contradiction to Thomism, which, for the guys, they sound like we are almost passive. Like the grace, almost like we were saying with the cake, in actually the extreme example where like we are passive and like.
It wouldn't be like that all the time. I mean, there can be graces that are like almost irresistible, but think about it. That's what I meant about it being sure knowledge. But those graces, like, that's not the typical grace, right? Like it's a cooperative thing,
and it's always almost. You're almost incapable of picking the bad, but you still can.
Yes.
I mean, we want to be passive to God eventually, but we're still choosing to be passive.
But you're
like,
saying passive is
you're
borderline
passive.
not having free will.
You submit in like you want His will, but like any decision is still an active thing on your end. It's never, in that regard, it's never passive.
Yeah.
Like Abraham sacrificing Isaac was a decision on Abraham's part, not some passive like, oh, God is moving my hand, and I'm incapable of doing anything.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think that would be a Thomistic like understanding of grace and free will.
I haven't read up on it too much,
Go ahead, Colin.
So when you say free will is just used as a cause, and God will bring about this good thing, regardless, that can we not say that there are certain things that, let's say one of my friends walks up to me and we're having a conversation, and I get a note, it's like, okay, you should talk about this thing. And I'm like, that'd be really awkward, I don't want to do that. I mean, could we not say, okay, like that was the chance that God was trying to present to that person, such that my action in a real way affected their situation, or because otherwise it seems to make it very inconsequential if God is saying like, well, I guess I'm going to have to send in my number, it's not really my number 2 pick, but you know what I'm saying.
Well, it would depend in the plan of providence whether that was a necessary act or contingent. Like, is that necessary to God's plan of providence? We don't know. But, St. Thomas could say that there can be contingent things within the plan of providence that depend upon free will decisions that God leaves. And he just, knowing that you're not going to say anything, well, he's got another way for the grace to come back around.
But I guess that's a question. Would we always say, okay, that person, well, there's just going to be another avenue to the point where I'm almost, to a certain degree, irrelevant, says that I was going to be used?
Well, you're irrelevant anyway, in the sense that you're only relevant insofar as you cooperate in God's plan anyway. Like, that actually illustrates it, right? Like, insofar as you become his instrument is where you really become relevant anyway.
But can't someone, just like through scandal or something like that, somebody, I would say, I was like, we can see this person was a bad influence and this person had led them away from the faith. And this other person was a really good influence and they led somebody to the faith. It seems strange to say that, okay, if this person had fallen in with a better crowd, it would have been no better for them than if they had fallen in with this bad crowd. God had led them away. Like, there's going to be exact, like, if Augustine had converted the first time, when his mom prayed for him one time, like, it would have been worse, or would have been just as good for Augustine as if he had waited the whole time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so that part falls under, like, God's plan, like why Augustine doesn't convert the first time. But what we can say is that him not converting the first time brought about some goods that wouldn't have otherwise been there.
Is it inherently more goods, or just some goods?
Well, again, if we're going with the sort of matrix of maximizing goods, it's more, right? So there's a certain amount of like moral evil that's necessary, first of all, in order for God's mercy to be manifest. In a world where God doesn't allow moral evil, so where is his mercy manifest? Which is a good, right? Where is his justice manifest?
His mercy is part of his nature, right?
I mean, it's a manifestation of his love, right? So love is his nature, mercy is just sort of we'll call it an aspect of his love. Right? So these evils, certain goods can only come about in the presence of evil, right? Like, how does courage come about without evil? Yes?
A quick comment about what you just said about mercy. Could you say the same thing about, like if love is his nature, then we also say, like, God is justice. Is justice a manifestation of the love, or is that also his nature?
Yeah. I would say justice
it's not like it's different.
Yeah, justice is a sub-type of love, so that it sort of all... So, actually, hold on until we get to the question about God's suffering, and then we'll talk about his love, because that ties to the other question you had about loving. Yes?
So in effect, what we can say is that there's nothing you can do that does not glorify God in some way, shape, or form.
Yes. Because of this. As Augustine says, since God is the highest good, he would not allow any evil to exist in his works unless his omnipotence goodness were such as to bring good even out of evil. Right? Only God can create out of nothing. Evil is nothing. God creates. That's why we can't do it. Right? That's why we can't take evil and try to make good come from it. Because God literally creates out of nothing. He creates a good that wouldn't have been there otherwise. Right? And so the whole argument to begin with is almost nonsensical in the sense that only an omnipotent God who is all good could do that. Right? Like, so if this person at any time in their life has ever experienced, this is what Kevin was saying, one time where something good came from something bad happening to them, they've just proven what I said. Where did the good come from? If not from an all-powerful, omnipotent God. And all good. Right? Think about that for a second.
But if God was all powerful, couldn't He have bought that good in a different way?
Not in the world is the way it is, right? Not if His plan is the way it is, right? If His plan that manifests His goodness is the way it is, that good comes about only because of that. Only because in the presence of evil, the act of courage only came about. The act of courage, which is a good.
Some people have more courage than others. Couldn't God infuse the same courage to everyone? I don't know.
But it wouldn't be yours, right? Like, so remember, He's raising sons, not like automatons, not these people He just wants to give rewards to. He wants people that are like Him, like His Son, right? And so, yeah, He could infuse all the courage, and sometimes does that, right? Like St. Thomas, He infused chastity into him, right? Never had an unchaste thought after that. But it was all for His glory because He needed to be able to focus on His work. Right? He thought clearly because He was perfect. Like, anytime you want to know how chaste you are, go read St. Thomas and realize, I can't think that way. I'm nowhere near. But that's the point, right? So he goes, okay, this level of chastity that he needs for this clarity of thought, he'll never get there without it being infused because I need these other goods to come about, right? So he gives it to him. Go ahead, Steve.
So would it be fair to say, like, when people talk about, like, the ends don't justify the means versus, like, utilitarianism perspective, like, that the utilitarian is misunderstanding this, and that they think, oh, if I do this bad thing, like, it's going to bring about this good end. But in reality, what you're doing is you're forcing God to create more good from that.
Yeah, well, you're trying to usurp your God, right? You're trying to be God, right? And you're not trying to. Yeah, that's never a good idea.
But so if more good comes from evil than no evil, we still shouldn't do. I guess that goes to when some people talk about confession and say, like, confession gives us more graces than if we hadn't sinned. But that doesn't mean we should just keep sinning and going to confession because.
No, I mean, sin caused the incarnation, right? Like,
but grace also comes from you choosing to not sin. So, like, I think it's more like the more goods are just going to come out of, like, what ends up happening, given, like, this is the world that God created. So you can't just say, oh, me sinning is going to get more goods. Because, like, if you, in that moment, choose not to sin, that's going to be more good than had you chose to sin and then went to confession.
Okay, so I die and go to hell. Is it better for me to be in hell than to not exist?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that is obviously true because God chooses it. But could we, like, what is non-existence compared to existence? I have no idea. Like, I have to take that on, almost on faith that existence is better than non-existence.
So what does it mean when Jesus says it's better that, like, I mean, the Judas didn't existed?
Well, I did say he was never born, right? And what he means, like, there's only one way to sort of interpret that, right? Is that Judas is in hell. Although I would get probably pushback from some people about that.
But my confusion is, if God knows from the beginning that he was going to be in hell, did he have a choice?
Yes. Yeah. He knows because of the choice. Like, he knows the choice that Judas is going to make. Right?
But then he doesn't have free will, right?
He knew he would be in hell, but still chose to create it?
No. My question is, if God knows that Judas would be in hell, whatever he does, he will be there. So is he free?
No. So yeah. So I think you're getting stuck in, like, before and after thinking with God. The only reason why God knows that Judas is in hell is because Judas did all the things to go to hell. So he knows everything all at once, right? Like, it's not he goes, if I create Judas tomorrow, I think he'll do all these things and he'll go to hell. He sees everything all at once. And so he knows Judas is going to, just like he knows that Abraham's going to do what he's going to do, because Abraham did it. Right? So, like, avoid, like, the before and after thinking of thinking, like, he knows all of Judas's free will decisions because Judas made those decisions. He just knows it, and it's hard for us to see that.
I think he used a lot of he's without clarifying if he's talking about God or Judas.
Okay.
Like, were you saying that, does that mean Judas does not have free will?
Yeah. Yeah, so Judas has free will because God sees Judas all at once. Right? And so he knows what he's going to do. Right? But he only knows those things because Judas actually does them. So how does he know that Judas is going to going to betray Jesus? Did he force it to happen, or is it because Judas did it?
But he knew it even before Judas came into the world.
You see, you're back into before. That's the problem, right?
But is it a useful exercise to say, like, I can look on my past and see that things happened a certain way insofar as I can remember them, yet I still had free will. So, like, the knowledge doesn't change the fact that I have free will.
Yeah, I mean,
does that help?
Certainly is part of it. Yeah, I mean,
prove that
if
those
you
can
look
go
back on Nicole's life, you could do that, right? Like, if you were to see what she's doing in the future, just because you know it doesn't mean you forced it, right? So step outside of yourself. Yes.
So you said it's better for people to be in hell than to not exist. So when you clarified the language, you were saying it was better for Judas not to have been born, as in to have died before birth, or so not that he didn't exist, that he just wasn't born.
Yeah.
But how?
Because that's what Job does, right? Like Job curses the day. Like, he tries to curse the day he was conceived, but then he curses the day he was born.
But then with the whole things about the fact that, like, the whole sketchy baptism stuff, like, it's not good to not have been born because we're baptized.
What now?
Why would he have been born?
Who? Oh, Job? No, that's why he corrects himself. Oh.
Judas, why would he have been born if it was better for him to not have been born?
Oh no, yeah. So I think Jesus means that in the sense of what he did.
This goes with Connor's question.
As compared to what he did. Like, so again, this goes back to his question, right? Is remember, it's all at once that he sees Judas, right? So it's better that Judas wasn't born because Judas had to be born to do all the things he did.
Would it have been better for Judas to be in heaven? Could God have given Judas grace to be saved?
But we don't know if he's in heaven.
Would it have been better? And you're saying that what happens is the best. So
wherever he is the best.
So if we presume that Judas is in hell, for example, then we would say that. See, this is hard because now you're looking at it from Judas' perspective, not good, but from the manifestation of God's goodness, with including the invitation to live with Him forever. It's better that it ended up the way that it did.
So for Judas, it's worse that he's in heaven than hell.
Worse than it would be worse for Judas if he was in heaven instead of hell.
For Judas,
yes.
Yeah, it would be worse for Judas to be in heaven than in hell.
What?
Why?
Because
heaven
not
would be
exist.
hell for him.
But he would.
So God is a consuming fire, right? What does that mean? That means anyone that goes before Him without sanctifying grace would literally suffer.
So hell is not justice.
Huh?
Hell is not justice.
It's both. It can't be. It's both just and merciful. Yeah, it's both just and merciful. It's better for Judas that he's in hell than in heaven, because he's not the kind of person that could stand in heaven. He would be worse off. So take someone, for example, like, is it better for someone to be in church or on Skid Row? Depends on the person. Depends on the kind of person they are, right? Like, if they're the kind of person who really likes heroin, like, Skid Row is way better than church.
The use of the word better is very confusing here. So you're saying it wouldn't have been better for them to be in a state of...
I don't mean like objectively, like looking at them better. Yeah, of course it would have been better for them to be, but it is what it is. So given their current state, which is better? Hell or heaven? And for Judas, heaven would be worse than hell.
So is it like God is doing some people a favor by putting them in?
Well, He's doing what's best for them at the moment, right?
How is that justice then? If you're giving someone the best they could possibly have.
Well, that's again. That's so you're trying to make a moral judgment of God when justice is giving to each his due, right?
Yeah.
But that's not really how God. Like, that's the human conception of justice, right? For God, it's giving what is proper to its nature. We call God just, not as a moral evaluation of Him, but to say that He creates something and then makes it fulfill its nature and its purpose.
I mean, if you go to hell, can you say that? I mean, you want to be there. So, well, God says, your will be done.
Yeah, you'd rather be there than the alternative.
So hell is locked from the inside.
I guess you could. Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say that. But I mean, everyone in hell knows what they're missing out on, but they hate God. And they don't hate them just because they're in hell. That's part of the reason. But that they have the experience that pain of loss of what they could have had, and they don't experience repentance, and they experience just absolute hatred of God. Yes?
So would it be like theoretically possible to repent in hell?
No.
Why not?
Because your will gets, like, our will fixes upon the good, right? Like the individual goods as we see them. When you die, your will is fixed on whatever it's been fixed on the whole time. You become like it. This is why Jesus says you're like an angel. So angels, they make a decision, and their will is fixed. We get to make and change our minds, but at a certain point, when you lose the body, you can't change your mind any longer. So you would not. It's not a matter of can they or can't they. They wouldn't want to. It wouldn't even dawn on them.
But in purgatory, you would.
Yeah, purgatory, like the part of the pain of it is knowing the one you loved is you've let them down, and you can't wait to get all that out of the way.
Could God have given Judas grace to be saved?
No. He did give him grace to be saved,
and Judas rejected it.
Yeah. So could he? He did, because if we believe God wills all men to be saved. Right? Now, if we get into the mixture, like why he didn't choose, I have no idea why he didn't choose the grace, but he did give him the grace to be saved, just like he gives every single person on the face to do it. And our goal is to help that person respond to that grace.
Does he have to give the grace multiple times?
So, does he have to? No. Does he? Probably.
Okay.
Is it reasonable to assume that like everybody is given like enough grace for them to like?
I think it's very reasonable. Like again, if that's God's will to save everyone has been given enough actual grace to move them by the time it's all said and done.
From a free will perspective, is it accurate to describe it like a seesaw, and like God gave us a completely balanced seesaw, and it's like completely up to us to choose him or to not choose him?
Yeah, in the end, yes.
And every single person has that.
So I mean, he wants us to be the kind of people who can make a decision, like on our own in a certain sense, like not like so he doesn't overwhelm us with grace, because he wants to credit the decision to us, right? And so, but in the end, well, there will be this sort of balance of like you had probably more than enough grace, and then because it's not again we're in time, so you don't just. It doesn't just come along once. Yes.
Is there infinite grace in the Eucharist?
Sure.
Okay.
Because the source of grace is in the Eucharist, right?
So,
no. I will say. I'll actually answer that question. Say no, because grace is a created thing.
What is grace?
So sanctifying grace is a created thing, right? So it doesn't. It's not God Himself.
Okay.
Right, and only God Himself is infinite. So it's not infinite grace. Even though Christ is in it, so there is a
grace.
There's sufficient grace in the Eucharist for like one reception to be saved, right? Because that's again John 6. It's Christ. What are you saying?
Is a proper definition of grace like becoming like God, or can you define grace?
So sanctifying grace is how we become partakers of the divine nature. So it's the divine nature accidentally infused into our soul. So we don't become God. We have become godlike in that we have godlike divine nature attached to our soul. Think of it that way. So it's our participation in the divine nature.
But we can grow in this, right? Like we can have.
Yeah,
I think the Lord was talking to St. Catherine of Siena. He's like, everyone brings a candle of faith, but some people have other people have a little one.
We can grow in it, but it's over, like, you can't manufacture it, right? Like, it doesn't, you don't seed it and it grows in you. God keeps giving you more. So as long as we just grow in that sense, like, each meritorious act makes our grace expand, or we get more of it.
I officially understand nothing.
I don't understand anything. I just sound like it.
I think you're closer to understanding things.
So, you guys want to keep going the grace route, or do you want to do the point question?
I just want to.
Yeah.
Everyone vote in the Facebook page and choose grace and free will as the option.
Yeah, especially like if you want that as a topic, vote for it, because that's one I have to be able to prepare for. Like I can't just get up like you can't tell me on like Thursday, hey, Sunday we'd like to do grace and free will. That one's going to take a little thought.
I added that.
So yes, if you're on the Facebook Like if you're on Facebook, go on and vote for what the topic you want for that one that we're adding. Okay. All right, so this will help us to answer Keegan's questions about God's love. All right. So there is an idea of, can God suffer?
In his human nature.
Okay, that's the answer. But what people, when they say this, what they mean is, can God suffer in the divine nature? All right, so God. Let's use God in the sense of not in the sense of the incarnation.
But does that mean like is it suffer or joy, or is there like a neutrality? Like does he get joy from people in hell? Like he doesn't like suffer anguish from them. I would accept that. It's completely neutral to the people in hell.
I don't know. Let's talk about it.
It feels weird to say God.
Yeah, so that's like a little more complicated. Let's just go from the when someone is suffering on earth. Does God suffer with them?
If we say God cannot change, then it necessitates no.
Okay. All right. So, all right. Let me play a little devil's advocate, right? So Keegan's answer is, because God is unchangeable, immutable, therefore suffering implies change. Therefore, he can't suffer. Right.
Except on the cross with us.
Right. Okay. So here's my question for you. Like, how can God love us without suffering? This is the logic behind this question.
But God is love, and love requires suffering, so he has to.
All right, who agrees with what Kevin just said? Because this is the thought process.
I'm going to say from like a human perspective, love requires suffering, but I'm going to say not from a divine. I agree.
I think love requires sacrifice, honestly.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I'll grant.
I mean,
you,
I was just pulling a saint
I'll
quote.
grant
So.
you the sacrifice could be suffering. I'll let you use those two terms
Or maybe it's a blessing.
synonymously, because sacrifice, in a certain sense, requires suffering, right? Because you're letting go of something.
Well, if heaven is just mass, like all the time, and sacrifice is suffering, then yes, God is always suffering because he loves us.
It's in his human
I mean, does our guardian angel need to suffer to love us?
I don't know. That's what we really want. So is there suffering in the guardian angel when he sees us screw up or something? So maybe. Like, let's go back to the God question. So you see, well, this is like an interesting question because it starts the question of like God's love. We know he can't change, and suffering would change. But the flip side of it is, it seems that God doesn't love us that much if he doesn't suffer when we suffer. Right?
So he can, for all eternity, like, see all that's happening and himself freely will to, be upset that we're doing this to ourselves. Is that correct?
Upset is a weird word to use for.
Yeah, like upset is but does he not suffer because he sees the big picture? Because then that would say something about seems to be that he's somehow dependent. His love depends upon creation, rather than creation depending upon his love. There's a sort of a hidden premise in here that we need to sort of attack.
His human nature suffering, like he can suffer in his human nature, like in the Garden of Gethsemane, seeing that people would reject his sacrifice.
Yeah.
And
So
that,
what
his human nature suffering.
What Nicole's saying, part of this is when we look at the incarnation, we ought to really question whether our idea is correct. Because if God could already suffer, why did he suffer in the incarnation? Right.
Are we saying that sacrifice, suffering, whatever is necessary for love, or is that what we're challenging?
That's what I'm challenging. I'm asking whether that is the case.
Say no.
Yeah, I'd say no, but I don't.
So let me ask you a question. So let's suppose that I know someone who is suffering. Okay. Do I have to share their suffering in order to show them love?
Yes.
Does compassion require that I suffer with them?
I don't know if that's right.
Scott had passion.
My initial instinct is to say yes, but the fact that the other is suffering is not a necessity. So, like, there can be love without suffering, but if one of two persons is suffering, there can't be love there if one of them is not suffering. I don't know if that was...
If one or both of them.
Well, so for instance, if we as humans did not suffer, God doesn't suffer, that love is still there. If we suffer, God has to suffer in order to love us. I don't, but like that in the incarnation there, but that seems to follow. I don't actually.
Okay, so let me try to rein it in a little bit. So let's just go down to two alternatives. So God does suffer with us, and so he loves us and he suffers as well. So now, what happened to God? What does he have to relieve in himself? So we admit that when we see someone suffering and we begin to suffer with them, there's a little bit of self-love in it that we want to also relieve our suffering, right? Like you think about you do something for someone because you feel bad about it, right? So if something causes me suffering, then I will naturally seek to not just relieve someone else's suffering, but my own.
Sure.
And so I act not just to relieve their suffering, but my own.
So it would be better, you could show a more deep love if you did not.
I can give more love to the person. Let's just say there's a finite spray bottle of love. I give more to them when I don't have to give any to myself. So God, being love, actually loves us more by not suffering, because he has no suffering of his own to relieve.
So like a psychopath who feels, right, I don't know if that's right.
I like how you go from God to psychopath. I want to see where you're going with this.
Someone who feels no emotions. I don't know what that is.
Yeah, so don't get, this is what
I know.
Stephen was warning us about, like, don't get the analogy wrong. Like he was warning him, he didn't say it that clearly, but like don't get the analogy of love flip-flop. Like start with God as the exemplar and us, our love as the model of it.
I was using more of that to get to like the suffering aspect.
Go ahead.
So like if they don't emotionally suffer, because I feel like that's part of it. Like our suffering is our I mean, I guess reasonably no, because if our intellect was over our will, over our passions, you're saying it would be better for our intellect to command ourselves not to feel sorrow at some point.
So was Mary suffering at the foot of the cross? Or suffering? She suffered.
Yes. Yeah, but it was pure. It wasn't. Was
it because she was sad, or because of what was happening to Christ?
Because of what was happening to Christ.
So totally disinterested. That's what disinterested love means, right? Like she commanded her, she had perfect control of her emotions. So she commanded her emotions to be sad in order to love Christ more.
So you're saying she did not suffer?
No, I'm saying she did suffer, because that's the human, that she did suffer, but her reason for her love was pure because she wasn't seeking to relieve her own suffering.
So that kind of seems to defeat the crux of the original thing you said, where God must not suffer. And
so that's what I'm saying about not flipping the analogy, though, right? So Mary loved fully in human terms because her emotions also were a part of it, right? But in that love, there was no desire of her own to relieve her own suffering. That's the whole point of her. She's at the foot of the cross and won't go anywhere, right?
Is it like
she's chasing Christ?
Like in the first reading today, the men, the ones he counted his sufferings as nothing. He was like, I literally don't care whatever you do to me. I care about God's law more.
Yeah, in the end, exactly.
Yeah.
So if the Mary now, that's kind of almost a little red herring. Don't get stuck on that. Look at it from God's perspective, that He loves us more by not having, and not to mention, if God is the cause of the relieving of our suffering, He can't do it unless He is above suffering.
But so in the aspect that you would say, Mary looks at the cross and says, it is proper for me to feel anguish, and does. Is it not proper for God to feel anguish.
I think that's
Is
strictly
Mary's
within
nature
the
different than
human.
God's?
Yeah. Okay.
That's strictly within like the human nature within this, because like Christ obviously suffered as well. Like that didn't lessen his love for us because he did it purely. But like I think our definition of love that we're wrapping up with suffering, like it only holds within the human nature. Like it just doesn't hold in the divine.
Yeah, so the person that does this, I mean, Stephen kind of summed it up, like they're anthropomorphizing God, right? They're flipping the analogy. They're not realizing that, oh, God is love means really God is love. Like he pours out the fullness of love at all times on everything, okay, and everyone. But what is received is according to the mood of the receiver. So the sinner receives mercy, right? They receive the fullness of God's love as mercy, right? The sufferer receives it as balm, whatever. So that but it doesn't. God's love doesn't change, right? And the fuller, like we talked about last week, the fuller the vessel to receive, the more love the person receives, right? So yes, God loves us equally, but we don't receive God's love equally. None of us do.
So you went through suffering, and so like you would say, like the righteous receive God's love as praise, as recognition, as
share glory. I don't know how you would define it, but yeah. I mean, all of us receive it as mercy, right? Because He's elevating us to something. But yeah, we receive it at different aspects of it. But all of it is God's love. Yes, Keith?
Does God love everyone?
Yes, because if He didn't, they wouldn't exist, right?
Because what were you talking about getting to at the end that you said at the beginning with that?
That was this. So, but He loves everyone, but not everyone equal.
What was that original, very first quote?
I don't know. That was like 2 hours ago.
I mean, it literally was.
Wait, so are you saying that God doesn't need to suffer to love, but because He created us as humans, baked into that decision, He's also committing to sharing in that suffering with us in order to love us?
Sharing
human nature.
Only in the sense of the incarnation. That's His response, but not in the divine nature.
Okay.
Right, because there's no change or anything in God. He can't suffer.
So if He never created us, He wouldn't have needed to create. Jesus would not have needed to take on human nature, and then God would never need to suffer.
Nature, right, to take on. So
yeah.
Which quote was it?
Next one. It's scripture.
It's the first one.
Yeah. And we know that.
Is it exclusive to those who love Him? Does God only work in good? Does God
only in the sense that, like, how St. Paul means it? Yes, but if we were to broaden it and take it out of context, God works for the good of each and every. Cool.
But I mean, this is saying that, like, if you love Him, you'll be saved.
Yeah, I mean, this is in the midst of St. Paul talking about suffering, right? Like he's saying, keep your eyes fixed on the prize. Like even if you suffer, all things work for good. Right, but if you don't love God, then suffering goes to waste. Is what his point is, right? So out of context, Keegan's question is yes, but in context, no.
God gives the best to everyone according to their ability to accept the best.
Now, whether they hold it or not, different. Like totally.
Well,
like think of your soul as like this petri dish, right? That's somehow worked in a certain way so that all this grace can go into it, and only that amount of grace. Like that's God's plan, right? But our free will decisions bend that, kind of make it, concave instead of convex, and grace falls out, and it eventually gets to the point that grace can't even go in, right? That's mortal sin. That's when you have to go to confession.